Yeah, yeah. Unashamed, unafraid. I'm trying to walk the walk. Truth on the mic, no shame here, just real talk. Came from the outside, never fit in. Now we tell the story and the healing begins. No front, no mask, just telling the truth. Keep it real, keep it raw, speaking straight from the booth. If you feeling like an outsider, this one's for you. Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Unashamed, Unafraid. We are unashamed of sexual addiction recovery and unafraid of coming unto Christ for healing. It is boot camp season. Shout out to Warrior Heart Boot Camp. We've got 4 boot camps coming up between now and September 24th. Utah is going to be May 14th. Alaska is July 27th. Idaho is September 14th. And Washington, which is new this year, will be September 24th. We sponsor scholarships for Warrior Heart Boot Camp. If you haven't been to boot camp, today's your day. Get online at awarriorheart.com, apply for a scholarship, sign up for one of these boot camps near you, or you can go into unashamedunafraid.com/scholarships and apply for a scholarship through our organization. We want to get you there so you can get healed. In my opinion, it is one of the best tools to help you get into recovery. Today, I'm going to take a back seat, and I'm going to let Jasmine, my wife, kind of run the show. We've got Roxy Johnson, who is the author of Forgotten of the Battle with Sexual Addiction, The Journey of a Spouse, a book that Jasmine and I have actually been reading while we go on walks or listening to together. It's been a huge help to us, and this is kind of part 3 of a 3-part series that Roxy has done for us. So welcome back, Roxy.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been enjoyable, and I hope it helps somebody.
So for this episode, we wanted to hop into some discussion around boundaries. We were actually thinking about combining the discussion with boundaries into the last episode we did with Roxy, but there's just so much there that in order to fully cover it, we thought we needed a whole episode. So we are going to deep dive into boundaries. What are boundaries? How do they help in recovery? How do they help in a committed relationship? How do boundaries help a couple heal? Particularly, I think the perspective we'll capture today is, how do boundaries protect a spouse? So I'm really excited for this one. Where do you guys want to start with it?
We have a lot of questions, but I think first explaining just kind of the basics of what a boundary is would be a great place to start.
A really easy way to define a boundary is it says where I end and where you began. A lot of spouses in relationships where there's compulsion, they end up feeling over-responsible for their spouse and trying to keep the peace. And they often end up taking responsibility for someone else's actions, someone else's behavior. They take on trying to fix it. And those bring in manipulation. That expectation makes it so that it isn't a relationship that's going to flourish and grow. All relationships that flourish and grow have boundaries in them, which is really interesting because a lot of our society tells us that boundaries are selfish, but really boundaries are self-wise. And a spouse that holds boundaries is teaching the other spouse how useful boundaries are, and they're teaching any children in the home that it's okay to have your own safety needs. Do you need to breathe? Do you need to be able to feel safe when you sleep? Do you need to have your physical needs met? Do you need to have your spiritual needs met? Those are the reasons why everyone should have boundaries. Boundaries are universal and yet so personal. So when I first was introduced to boundaries, first of all, I didn't know where to start. So that's why I have the questions of, do you need to breathe without fear? Do you need to sleep without fear? Do you need to take care of your body needs, your spiritual needs? I gave all those things away to try and keep peace in my home. And it didn't work. There was still tons of chaos. And I had to back up and say, what are my needs and how do I meet them? And then you start developing, I call them iterations, because they're going to change through time and through the journey of a person learning to hold boundaries. Maybe someone to study. If you're Christian, Jesus Christ had boundaries. He never railed on anyone. I'm sure that was a boundary. He took time for himself when he was depleted of his energy. I'm sure that was a boundary. He never told half-truths so someone wouldn't feel a certain way. I'm sure that was a boundary. He's a really good model if somebody wants to study keeping good boundaries.
I love that you brought that up. I've had a lot of experiences in my life, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, where we feel like our place, because we do have a savior, is to just extend mercy, when really extending mercy without limits just enables bad behavior. We really were commanded to uphold the paradox of both mercy and justice. Justice in this case would be upholding boundaries and knowing how to do so.
You saying that, Jasmine, that's really important, because in difficult relationships, especially if there's the drama triangle and persecution or deceit happening, the kindest thing you can do is to gently hold your boundaries. My favorite boundary to this day is if I feel angst or demeaned or unsafe, I give myself enough time and space to get good with God and with myself so that I can make the next right decision. So if that's a person's boundary and their spouse is not in a good place, they're not being kind, and shame is spiraling their behaviors, the reason why boundaries are so kind is because it allows the spouse to keep themselves safe and calm so that they won't let the other person misuse them. And so the other person doesn't add those negative behaviors to their shame. There's a dividing line that actually helps invite the person struggling with compulsions into better behavior. It might not look like it, because most people who struggle with compulsions, when boundaries start to be set, they fight against them. They fight hard against them. And I can give you some examples later on of what I've seen and experienced. It's kind of like they want to know where their territory ends, so to speak. And boundaries add a safety component for both spouses, even if they don't recognize it at that time.
And they're looking and asking for safety because they don't know where to find it.
Right. Yeah.
What would it look like to set a boundary? How would that conversation go?
What I talk about in my book is you have to figure out where you need your boundaries. One of the things that Jack and I got into a really bad habit for is fighting at bedtime. And
Just
Sorry. That's so relatable.
It is.
we relate to
isn't it?
this. We relate.
Jasmine and I really struggle with that.
Yeah.
Always an argument at bedtime.
It like saves its spot for bedtime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't
Yeah.
it? If both parties haven't responded appropriately, it can spiral, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the air is just really unpleasant and it doesn't feel safe, does it? I was attending 12-step meetings. I was going to therapy, and it was suggested that a good boundary might be to ask Jack to sleep downstairs. Well, the problem is that when you need to set a boundary like that with a spouse, most of the time, they're not in the frame of mind to adhere to that boundary very well. And so that caused arguments. And I tried to say, well, if you don't go downstairs when I ask you, then I'm going to call your sponsor, or all these manipulative things. And it just brought more contention and mocking, and it was not good. One night, it was particularly toxic, just the unsafe feeling. I just could not relax. I wasn't going to be able to sleep. But somehow in those moments, the Spirit got through and said, go downstairs. And I went, yeah. And I didn't say a word, and I just gathered up my things. And Jack said, where are you going? And I said, downstairs. And that was the start of me understanding that boundaries were about me. They weren't about enforcing or coercing or control of any kind. They were about my safety. I had a wonderful night's sleep that night, and it changed the dynamics, because not only when we were both in a bad place could I go downstairs, but what happened is it started Jack thinking that I really did see things differently than he did. It allowed a place to open up for us to have conversations where he would actually say, tell me about why you're angry. Help me understand what you are feeling. Boundaries are what started conversations like that.
You've mentioned before, and this is in your book too, that boundaries will create conflict.
Oh, yes.
Explain that a little bit, because a lot of times in my own life when I set boundaries and it creates conflict, it can cause me to wonder.
True. A lot of people who talk about boundaries talk about the if-then formula. I take that a step further, because the if-then formula can spiral into control. If you are yelling at me, I will do this. To me, that takes the emphasis off of what a boundary is. So instead, and this is after several iterations, this is after trying and writing down boundaries and refining them and revising them, probably 3 years of working on boundaries and trying to understand with the help of God what a good boundary was. But I discovered, if I wrote down, if I feel bullied or demeaned, then I get to ask for a timeout. It didn't matter whether Jack was in fact bullying me, or if I was super emotionally thin that day and just was not in a good place to have a conversation. Either way, we took a timeout. That's the other thing that boundaries and recovery are about, is practicing. So that's what I suggest, is that spouses do the if-then formula, but if I feel, then I will. If I know, then I will. If I see, then I will. Okay, because they bring the focus back on the person who's setting the boundary, right?
That is really good, because it's not about what you're doing, but my experience in this relationship. Mm. That would have saved me and Jasmine a lot of pain if we knew that 4 months ago.
You know, the interesting thing is, no matter the situation, when a boundary has to be held, a lot of times there's discord in that relationship, right? So if I say, whenever you yell at me, I get to leave the conversation, well, where does that leave Jack if he doesn't think he's yelling at me? So instead, if I feel bullied or demeaned, then I get to say, can we revisit this in an hour? Or can we revisit this tomorrow after work? Or can we revisit this with our therapist?
That is helpful because without boundaries, you're enabling behavior. And if you do set a boundary that isn't based on you and it's based on them, then it's controlling.
Exactly. You know, the way you tell whether a boundary is controlling or not is your intention. And so I'll tell you a story if you'd like. And it's about a really tough time and a really hard boundary. Jack, his compulsions, they had escalated to the point of addiction and physically acting out. And we were in recovery. We were both working at it. We were both working at it really hard. This is not when D-Day happened. This is not the bomb. This is when we got into recovery and we were both actively working toward seeing if our marriage would survive, okay? During this time, there was 2 very serious relapses. And on the second one, I consulted with therapists and with members of my support group before allowing Jack to come home. But I had prayed over him coming home. I felt that I should allow him to come home, which took a lot of emotional and spiritual work on my part, because in some ways I felt like we had gone back to ground zero. But as part of him coming home, there were boundaries. And because I had been through one very serious relapse, and because I had been through D-Day when my life was totally undone, and because I had watched my husband go through enough therapy and enough recovery work that I knew he understood what recovery was. One of my boundaries was, I am going to fill out divorce papers. It wasn't something that I did in haste or in anger. It was a decision made with the help of my higher power, and I felt very strongly. And it cost me a bit of money I didn't have. And anyhow, when I held this boundary, he kicked and screamed, so to speak. And one of the things that happened is he hurt himself on purpose. It was a form of manipulation. And that ended up with consequences he was not prepared for. And it was really, really uncomfortable. He was so angry. He was angry at himself. He was angry at me. But this whole time, Jasmine, I was able to hold that boundary because I knew in my heart it was a boundary that had been difficult for me to set and that I had set it with the best intentions. It was for my safety because it became a boundary to a bottom line. And bottom lines are nothing to mess with. They cannot be threats or they are manipulation. I struggled with this boundary. I struggled to hold it. But in the end, I did. I knew it was right. And it was a couple of years later when Jack had entered full recovery, when he let me know that that boundary was pivotal in his choosing good choices one day. And so it did affect his behavior. Was it made to control his behavior? No. It was made for my safety. Either way he would have chosen, I know that that boundary was an honest boundary and that God would have helped me with either outcome.
What I love about what you shared there is so much of the time as the person who's struggling with an addiction in my life, my closest relationships, particularly with my mom growing up, I learned that I could have the cake and eat it.
Mm-hmm.
No one really set boundaries with me. Now that for sure looked different when I was a teenager, but I believe in the power of healing the relationship through boundaries. Not only does it help you, meet your own needs, but it's better for the relationship.
And that takes a lot of courage to set a boundary, and even more courage to uphold a boundary when in the middle of having to uphold it, you feel like it's fighting against you, or your partner maybe feels like you are controlling them when your intention really isn't. So what advice would you give to spouses when they're having a hard time upholding the boundary that they know they should uphold?
So I agree with everything you just said. It answers your question, Jasmine, as well. Cloud and Townsend, I believe, they wrote a book on marriage and boundaries. What they pointed out is that anger is evidence of unmet needs. So when a spouse can use her boundaries to gently and firmly say, I am important and my needs deserve to be met and I'm going to meet them, it models for the spouse struggling with compulsions those very important behaviors they need to put into place for their own healing. The beautiful thing is that when a spouse can find the ability to make and revise and refine their boundaries, they learn who they are. And they learn that they are worth keeping safe. And it no longer is even tempting to use those boundaries as control. It is simply about keeping their peace. And that peace is so delicious to them after what can be sometimes years of chaos, that they keep that peace with love. They detach with love. They can honestly look at their spouse and say, I'm holding this boundary, and I can see that you are kicking against it, and you are very angry, and I will pray for you, and I hope you can work this out. I know that because I came from a place where I would routinely say, I hate him. Early in recovery, I figured out, and I made my own boundary for myself. See, boundaries are about yourself, too, about keeping your own sanity and safety and peace in yourself. And I made a boundary that I couldn't say that because it wasn't true. I might hate what Jack had chosen to do, but I didn't hate him in any way. And so the accumulation of setting these boundaries and that delicious peace that I was learning could be mine, even in a chaotic situation, was so motivating that I would spend the needed time to decide what I needed, to decide good ways of meeting those needs, and to also decide consequences that were logical and appropriate. You know, it wouldn't be a bad idea to read Love and Logic or some other parenting books because it kind of goes back to those basics of whether it's for behavior that your spouse has or whether it's your own behavior. You start putting logical consequences in place, and all they are is guards that help you realign yourself where you can choose to act in the way that you want to act.
That's so interesting that before we set a boundary, everything feels so out of your control. And when you learn how to set a boundary that is about you and not taking control of the other person, it just comes full circle and you realize how in control you really are.
Of yourself.
Of yourself.
Yeah. Especially in marriages that are struggling with compulsions and addictions, the only thing you have control of is your response, is your next decision, your plan to keep yourself and maybe even your children safe. And that is a really empowering place to be when you realize you can put pen to paper, even in the most chaotic situations, and get on your knees, and you can figure out a way to meet your needs and your children's needs, and do it in a way that you're behaving how you want to show up in life.
Yeah, that is empowering, and it's super hopeful.
It is, but when you're applying these boundaries, it can be so frightening when you have become the person who kind of hides in the corner and doesn't want to say what you really feel or what you really know. One of my boundaries was that I had to be completely honest. I had gotten in the habit of half-truths to just keep things even and going. And that was one of the hardest boundaries that I learned to keep. I adopted a mantra, be direct but do no harm. You cannot dance around what you mean to a person that's struggling with compulsions. They just won't get it. You have to be direct. But at the same time, that is so empowering. It is such a beautiful feeling when you can square your shoulders and say, I love myself and I love this other person, and therefore I will say what I see as truth, even if I know the response is likely to be negative. Because I know that my higher power will help me with the next decision and the next decision and the next decision. Every single marriage is a series of decisions every single day by both partners. And when even one of those partners is holding good boundaries, honest, thoughtful, firm boundaries, they are modeling good decisions in their life. Maybe not every single time, but most of the time. And it provides a fertile ground for upward growth. It almost invites the other spouse into growth. I will never forget the day shortly after that really hard boundary and other hard boundaries, but I was beginning to get it. I was beginning to understand that I could be happy no matter what. And Jack and I went out to dinner, and I still remember him looking across at me and saying, "You're moving on, aren't you?" And he didn't mean you're leaving me. He meant you are finding a better way. And I looked into his eyes with love. I put my hand on his, and I said, "Yes, and I would love you to join me."
That is really powerful.
It was.
What did that mean to you?
It meant he could see what recovery might offer him. And it meant he could see a better way.
I hear so frequently from friends or other women that I talk with and people who have commented on the biggest place in their life where they want to implement boundaries and just don't know how. Some of those are like when your spouse lies to you, or how to respond when your spouse tells you that they've relapsed. How do you recommend handling those?
You know, those are probably two of the hardest places I had to form boundaries. And I think they're probably two of the hardest places for most spouses. So let me address the relapse first. Spouses get to have their feelings. They do not get to be disrespectful, but they get to have their feelings. And holding that boundary, which is I get to say what my experience is, was very difficult for me. I had not been raised in a home where feelings were allowed, and the farther Jack got into his addiction, the more he wanted to shut down my feelings. And he had openly, verbally mocked my feelings. And so to get to a place where I could say, I am devastated, I am hurt, took a lot of courage on my side. But it was a boundary for me because I had to be willing to be seen for our marriage to heal. Without me being able to be seen, it would just be a fake marriage. And I had lived that. And I knew I wanted more and better. The other part of boundaries is the detaching with love. When your spouse can't hear your honest feelings about something they just disclosed, about a relapse or something significant like that, part of the boundary is that when my spouse is not in a good place, I have to detach with love, which means I'm hoping for God to teach them what I've let go of that I need to teach them.
Setting a boundary for yourself before you set a boundary with your spouse.
And you have to be willing to see if your spouse will do the work required to be able to sit with you when they have to be honest about a relapse. And by the way, honesty was not negotiable in my marriage. The more I learned about recovery, the more I understood that honesty, even about difficult things, had to be non-negotiable if I wanted a good marriage. Jack and I became able to talk about these very, very difficult things in ways that were respectful to both of us, even when we didn't agree with each other. But we learned to invite the other one to see our perspective. And part of the boundaries is you let go of their response. All you're asking for is to be seen and acknowledged.
I have a lot of friends who have gone through this, and I went through it in my first marriage all the time. Did you ever have an experience where your partner didn't want to open up anymore because of your response?
We had that fight so many times. That was the impetus for that story that I finally learned to go downstairs myself. I heard all sorts of things about you're being controlling. This isn't going to make things any better.
Or you're feeling angry, or you're crying.
See, this is how you respond,
Yes.
so I don't have to tell you or be honest. I'll just be honest with someone in group. I have many journal entries that are in the book where I journaled about the process of coming to the point where I could say, no, this is a good boundary, because this is about me knowing what kind of a man I am in a relationship with. If he cannot be honest with me, then I don't know who he is really. You become predictable when you are able to keep your own boundaries. Relationships without boundaries have manipulation, confusion, exhaustion. Relationships with boundaries have respect, honesty, humility, because each of those attributes have to be cultivated to hold a boundary.
I just really like going back to the beginning point that boundaries can create conflict, and conflict isn't always bad. It just uncovers things that you need to heal together.
What you just said is profound, because every conflict that a boundary brings up, Jasmine, is a conflict that marriage needed to address.
Your marriage is working, not failing.
Yeah. It doesn't always mean that you end up agreeing, but when you're able to resolve conflicts so that both parties feel that their needs are met at some level, and they acknowledge their own accountability, they show up and say, this person is important enough to me to have to dig into really difficult conversations. but I'm going to show up like I want to because of the person I want to be and because I care so deeply about that other person.
I know in a different episode that you've been in, you've talked about surrendering, and I want to know how that goes together with boundaries. So just to preface my question, when we're talking about surrendering, we're talking about surrendering to God and not surrendering to pornography or other compulsive behavior. That's where I've gotten stuck in the past, because when Sam discloses a relapse, I feel like I have to surrender to the fact that he just watched porn. I feel like I just have to brush it under the rug and have faith that Christ will cover it, when actually surrendering really means I am surrendering to God, who can carry these heavy feelings that I can't. It also means that I'm surrendering my husband to God, which makes all the difference. So how does that concept fit into the discussion of setting boundaries? What's the power behind it?
That is such a good question. So I'm going to tie that question with the deception as well. So one of my boundaries was I will not live in dishonesty. I wanted an honest marriage. Jack and I, after much discussion and some of it really unpleasant, we talked about transparency within 24 hours. I advocate for time limits. Each couple has their own specific time limit and way, but that was ours. There were times when Jack fought against that hard. And there were times when I had to decide what the consequences were because he broke my boundary. What I learned is that as long as I knew the boundary was a good boundary about my safety, then I could decide on the next right decision every single day. A lot of those days were chaotic. A lot of them had unkind words. A lot of them had fights. But I wanted an honest marriage. Surrender is part of that, because I could go down the rabbit hole so bad with what if. Through the surrender process, I learned to be able to say, I've done what I can, and I'm not in control of Jack. The other part that was so beautiful, I learned I was holding a good boundary because God revealed when Jack was deceptive. And that held out for the couple of years that life was really tough. So I learned that I could surrender Jack to his higher power, that I couldn't fix him, but God could. And one of the ways I learned that is because when we were fighting about this deception, the very most, when it was a make or break in our marriage, I didn't know it, but he had gotten hold of CDs. This is the olden days. They don't have them anymore. And it was two therapists discussing honesty within a marriage. And it was in those hard 3 or 4 months, holding firm that that was my boundary, I came to find out that God was teaching Jack about honesty in a way he could understand. And he came back to the marriage eventually, wanting to be honest. He actually put the marriage in jeopardy by admitting another relapse because he wanted to be clean more than he wanted anything. And so there were a lot of nights we slept separate. There were a lot of times I had to detach with love, and a lot of times that included some distance from my spouse, and I had to surrender him over and over. God, you're in charge. I'm not. Sometimes I had to do that 25 times a day. But he came back to the marriage eventually, wanting to be honest. And oddly enough, I never filed those papers because I realized that boundary had served its purpose because he finally wanted to be clean more than he wanted anything else. And I knew that was a man I could build a solid marriage with. So in many cases, surrendering and boundaries are intricately enmeshed. You can't do one without the other. And I want to tell your listeners, I had a marriage end in divorce as well. Jack died from health problems, and I tried to remarry. And I held boundaries in the same way. He chose not to be honest. He chose not to work at recovery. So you have to realize that just because you hold boundaries and you invite someone into recovery, there are no guarantees. Marriages are 100 decisions made by two very different people every single day. But the same principles have applied and kept me safe with two very different outcomes.
What would you say to tie this all together?
If you come at the work of recovery honestly in your own life, I believe that your higher power, whatever that is to you, will take you by the hand, literally almost, and walk you through every day. And that does not mean that every day will be good. I didn't have a clue what boundaries were when the bomb dropped in my life. I didn't have a clue. I was raised in an addictive home. Boundaries weren't allowed. And the reason why I bring that up is because I was about the most boundaryless person you could imagine. But I saw for myself in two different marriages with two different outcomes that as long as I was humble, honest, and accountable to my higher power, that he would walk me through the experience. And it's not something that you would wish upon anyone. But you cannot deny what you learn about yourself in the process. And boundaries are a good part of that.
Roxy, if someone wants to get access to your resources and learn from you, how can they do that?
I have a website, forgottenspouse.com. You can purchase the book from it. You can look at my social media, and there's also a contact page where you can contact me and I'll respond. My Instagram is also Forgotten Spouse. My Facebook is the title of the book, which is Forgotten in the Battle with Sexual Addiction, The Journey of a Spouse.
Roxy, thanks for coming on again. Just love having you on. Thank you.
I love being here because you guys are doing good work and it's important.
Jazz, thanks for coming on too. I learned a thing or two about your heart that I didn't know before. Love you.
Love you too.
Thanks for watching. You can find us on social media at Unashamed Unafraid. Get access to our bonus content and become an outsider on unashamedunafraid.com. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if this was helpful to you, it'll probably be helpful to someone else. So take some time right now and share it with a friend. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, continue to live unashamed.
Yeah.